Good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here. It's a little bit sad for me because for those of you who have been to every lecture, I think this has been a phenomenal series, and I have learned a lot. And I think we need to give a round of applause for Kate Pedersen, who couldn't be here tonight because she has COVID, which is a terrible way to end the series, and Leslie Jones, both of whom put this together. Bravo. We offered to all of you the opportunity to sign up for all 6 lectures, and I think 80 of you did so. So for those of you who did, would you please stand? You deserve a round of applause. Come on. Hey. Thank you. You all got a special card. This is a card that proves that you attended all 6 lectures, so we hope you enjoy it. And as I'm walking off the stage tonight, I'm going to give one to our speaker, Dr. Unger, because she too attended every lecture. So thank you, Nancy. Bravo. We could not do these lectures without our members, so we thank you very much for your support. If you are not a member, there's an opportunity to join. You can do it tonight. You can do it online. We've got about 50,000 members now around the world. We'd love to grow to 100,000, so you can help us out. And I also want to draw your attention to the fact that our next lecture, which is not quite a Gilded Age lecture series lecture, but it is an important one, is on July 13th at Marble House. 6 o'clock, it's the David Dangermond lecture featuring Michael Catherines, who has just written a book that is called Newport Cottages, 1835 to 1890, the summer villa before the Vanderbilt era. If you have not seen the book, it is phenomenal. And it captures houses that you perhaps do not know, but we'll learn a lot about. So we're excited about Michael Catherines returning. He's come to Newport frequently. He's a real expert on Horace Trumbauer, probably the country's foremost expert, and I think you'll enjoy him. So now on to the introduction of Dr. Unger. Nancy is a graduate of Gonzaga University. She received her master's and her PhD from the University of Southern California and is currently the chair of the history department at Santa Clara University. She is an expert on Gilded Age history, which we have been studying for the last few months, and that's why we asked her to be the finale speaker. She's got 4 books under her belt, including Fighting Bob La Follette, The Righteous Reformer, Belle La Follette, Progressive Era Reformer, and a final book called Beyond Nature's Housekeepers, American Women in Environmental History. 2 of those books will be here tonight. Nancy can sign them if you're interested. Nancy served as the chairman of the board of the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era from 2020 to 2022, has written many pieces, op-ed pieces, applying the lessons of the past to current American history. Her work has appeared in Time Magazine, The Washington Post. She's been on CNN, PBS, C-SPAN, National Public Radio, to just name a few. We could not have a more fitting lecturer than Nancy, so I want you to please welcome her. We're so glad you could come from California to visit with us tonight. We're looking forward to it. After the lecture is over, there is a standing mic. We invite you to ask questions. I think some of the questions in the last lectures have been fascinating. Please don't be shy. Keep the conversation going. So the mic is just right over there where Terry Dickinson is waving his hand. So please step forward, and Dr. Unger, please join us.
Well, thank you, Trudy, for that nice introduction. It's such an honor to be in this gorgeous room filled with people who are actually interested in the Gilded Age, and to be closing this amazing speaker series. I am so grateful to Kate Pedersen for inviting me. But I don't mind telling you, it's a bit intimidating to be last, following such expert, lively speakers. So tonight, we're not going to be talking much about the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, who personify the gilt or gold plating of this period, and only a little about the political reformers so expertly presented by T.J. Stiles, but much more about the everyday Americans. But identifying everyday Americans is always a challenge. Where I live in Mountain View, in the heart of California, Silicon Valley, the everyday people are engineers. When you meet somebody at a party, they say, "How do you do? Hardware or software?" But if you drive into the heartland of California, many of the everyday Americans are migrant farm workers, primarily Spanish-speaking. So, and it's just as impossible to be comprehensive about the everyday people of the Gilded Age as it is today. So I decided to sample a few representative groups. So let's start with old stock American farmers, who are primarily white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They go through rather a bewildering period. Previously, as this 1875 image illustrates, they were revered for living out the Jeffersonian ideal as hard-working, self-sufficient people upon whom everyone else was dependent. But with the coming of industrialization and urbanization, they suddenly find themselves derided as hicks from the sticks and suffering financially as the railroads charge all the market will bear rates. Here we see a farmer trying to raise the alarm that they are all literally about to be run over by a train. And here we see another brave farmer trying to beat back the railroad monster. The image of railroads as willful, powerful, and uncontrollable was a popular one. Here we see Uncle Sam's Wild West show. The Interstate Commerce Commissioners are moving in on the animals and are getting bucked off by the ferocious trains. The Gilded Age, as Matthew Bird so brilliantly and so entertainingly presented in his talk, is well known for its technological innovations, but the high price of the miraculous new labor-saving machinery reduced many a farmer to bankruptcy. We sometimes forget that some of the greatest progressive reforms came out of the beleaguered rural Midwest. Farmers threw their support behind leaders like Fighting Bob La Follette, who came to the Senate in 1906 after, as we see here, rescuing Wisconsin from the railroad monster and rendering it a model state with a bow in its hair. But not all rural people wanted to cling to old agrarian traditions. Many migrated willingly to the cities, looking forward to trading the endless labor of farm life for the many conveniences and attractions of urban life, with endless hustle and bustle that included modern marvels such as streetcars, telephones, electric lights, and inexpensive manufactured goods. They were eager to work at jobs that had starting and quitting times, and a day off a week, and to be paid for their labor in cash. As the United States grew increasingly urban, the cities were becoming rapidly populated not only by resettling Americans, but unprecedented numbers of immigrants. And not just the traditional, mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Northern Europe who had been generally welcomed previously. The new people flooding American shores were presented as not only economic villains because they would work for lower wages, but also as riffraff immigrants who posed a serious threat to the nation's ideas and institutions. The ensuing panic and efforts to limit immigration was not unlike what we are witnessing today, as the descendants of factory workers who displaced the farmers are themselves now increasingly being replaced by technology and/or new immigrants. They, too, often complain that the blame lies with overly liberal immigration policies. Catholicism was a particular Gilded Age bugaboo, as we see here, this is one of my favorites, with the Vatican in the background, Catholic bishops wearing mitres that turn them into crocodiles are clearly coming from the Protestant children on the American shore. The Irish, with their foreign allegiance to the Pope, were presented as the group that just couldn't mix. Other cartoons revealed the hypocrisy of such assertions. Here, wealthy American businessmen turn away a young Irish immigrant. We see, however, the shadows of their former selves when they were the young immigrants. In the wake of the 1882 Exclusion Act, a dejected Chinese man who, despite his baggage of industry, peace, and sobriety, is the only one barred out. Note on the left, the sign on the left, that communists, socialists, and hoodlums are still welcome. Anti-Chinese activism continued despite the Exclusion Act. Some of the next images are hard to look at. Here, San Francisco Bay features not the Statue of Liberty, welcoming earnest immigrants, but a Chinese man holding an opium pipe and radiating disease, immorality, filth, and ruin to white labor. In another riff on this theme, the Statue of Liberty herself is so appalled by what the European garbage ships are dumping on her shores that she's threatening to return to France. Here we see an extremely anti-Semitic depiction of the Hebrew line, bringing a boatload of Jews in which even the fish in the sea, seen in the bottom left, conform to negative stereotypes. And unlike the industrious Chinaman who was barred out, here we see a Jew carrying his baggage of Sabbath desecration, anarchy, disease, and poverty, able to walk right into the United States despite the obvious disapproval of Uncle Sam. Negative stereotyping wasn't reserved only for the new waves of immigrants. Traditional Native American culture was deemed so inferior that the nation entered into a period of forced assimilation under the slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man," resulting in before and after pictures like this one. When people wonder why, more than 150 years after the end of the Civil War, this country is still so plagued by anti-Black racism, I think some of the active promotion of racism in the Gilded Age provides important answers. Plessy versus Ferguson, legalizing racial segregation, was decided in 1896. Yet that pesky 15th Amendment granting Black men the franchise was still officially in effect. Here, we see why the Black man should not be allowed to vote, as this monster with the ballot box as his platform is destroying the white men and leaving the white women in peril. If allowed to vote, the Negro would crush the white man. The only solution? Stand back. The honest white man will not stand it. And when African-American activist William Monroe Trotter met with Woodrow Wilson in the White House to protest Wilson's support for segregation in violation of his campaign promises, here was the result. Trotter was kicked out of the White House. Other African Americans fared even worse, as this graph on lynchings represents African Americans in blue. Immigrants, African Americans, and Native Americans weren't the only groups presented as threatening to the nation. Even the white working class could be viewed as a threat. Some Americans worried about the inevitable results if plutocrat businessmen like Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt, shown here in 1883, resting on their bags of millions, they continued to claim that they were the protectors of American industries, even as they are upheld by labor at starvation wages. Note in the right foreground the hammer and sickle in the sea of hard times, suggesting the possibility of a workers' revolution. I think that concern is rendered particularly beautifully in this cartoon, entitled From the Depths. Is this the risk that the wealthy take by ignoring the conditions of the working class, a group that vastly outnumbers them? I love this cartoon because it so brilliantly captures the real potential for a violent class struggle. The slippery slope argument against organized labor went like this. It was the first step on a short downward journey to chaos. To be a working class laborer in the Gilded Age could mean a lot of things. It could mean working the land as a sharecropper or a miner. If you were lucky, usually meaning if you were white, it could mean factory work, which was higher paying than agricultural or domestic work. Of course, as we know, factories were set up to maximize profits, not worker safety. Here we see the child who was maimed on the job, and here the collapsed fire escape at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, a catastrophe that resulted in the deaths of 146 people, primarily Jewish girls and young women, 62 of whom jumped to their deaths rather than burn. Being a laborer could mean doing piecework, which was often carried out by women and their children in the tenements, for which they were paid a fraction of a cent per piece. As you'll note in this picture, the homes of the working class were a little different than the one that we're in tonight. If you haven't done so yet, the next time you're in New York, do yourself a favor and go to the Tenement Museum, where you'll walk through an actual tenement. The tour groups are very small because the staircases, the rooms, and the corridors are so cramped. And you must keep in mind that you're touring an upgraded tenement with toilets inside instead of down all those stairs and outside in the courtyard, as they were in the early years of the Gilded Age. Laborers, like this one working for the Pullman Railroad Car Company, found themselves being squeezed between the millstones of low wages and high rent. Like poor workers everywhere, they had difficulty finding the time, energy, and support to fight back against the powers that be. The diversity of languages, as shown by these signs, and cultures in this nation of immigrants made communication and unification difficult, but not impossible. Workers and labor leaders protested low wages, long hours, unsafe conditions, and stopwatch management that prized speed and efficiency over decency and human dignity. Major strikes included the Lawrence textile strike, quelled by the state militia, and the Pullman general strike, which was ultimately put down by federal troops. Workers were told in every possible language to go back to work. But it was more than strike breaking that kept everyday Americans from fomenting the kind of workers' revolution that was brewing in Russia. Everyday American workers faced differences in language and religion and a number of other factors, and found that the United States didn't offer a transformation from rags to riches. But elements of the American dream of a better life were fulfilled for many. Some received help from the local political machines described so compellingly by T.J. Stiles in his lecture, as members of the working class exchanged their votes for favors, a job, legal aid, emergency assistance. In an interesting twist, through a series of speeches to everyday Americans in urban centers around the country, journalist Lincoln Steffens called such transactions the shame of the cities, as democratic principles were traded for personal gain. In other words, in his speeches that became articles and then ultimately a book, he focused less on the bosses and more on the complicity of everyday members of the public in allowing corruption to continue. If you heeded Steffens' message, or you didn't vote the right way and you couldn't get help from your local political machine, you might have better luck with an ethnic or faith organization. The Knights of Columbus, the Sons of Poland, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or with the Masons or similar fraternal organizations. Many local churches offered social services to people who couldn't get them anywhere else. Compared to many countries of origin, the United States was a land of upward mobility. Poverty in America was a big step up from famine or pogroms. If you're looking for a wonderful depiction of working-class life in New York in the early 1900s that addresses discrepancies in the American dream, look no further than Betty Smith's novel, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Although all three generations of the Nolan family continue to live in poverty, there's a moment when the elderly Austrian immigrant picks up her American-born granddaughter and says, "This child was born of parents who can read and write. To me, this is a great wonder." The United States offered other marvels in addition to public education. As Will McIntosh so engagingly presented in his talk, there were beautiful playgrounds exclusively for the rich and for the middle class, but there were also public parks and inexpensive amusements for everyone. Most workers made enough money to have small amounts of discretionary income. You can imagine the delights in the new 5 and 10 cent stores. You could walk in with a dime in your pocket and know there was not a single item in that store that you could not afford. Maybe working class women couldn't afford to shop in the same designers' stores as the elite, but with the rise of department stores, more affordable fashions allowed factory workers to buy a fabulous hat and own a little piece of style and elegance. Even rural Gilded Age Americans found a world of shopping opportunities open to them through the Sears catalog. In the cities, a wealth of experiences were within the grasp of most working class Americans, including in coastal areas, the beach via public transportation. The boardwalk and amusement park in Santa Cruz, near where I live, is still running. I know that this Coney Island photo was in Will McIntosh's presentation, but I did want to show it again because I wanted to point out that rope. Most Americans couldn't swim. And so here we see that the beach goers are given the opportunity to hold on to a rope so they can more safely enjoy the waves. Next to this beach were amazing, elaborate amusement parks. This is the entrance to the Dreamland Park. And here's the main promenade. Amusement parks were so enormously popular that when Russian revolutionary Maxim Gorky toured Coney Island in 1906, he said that in this age of mass culture, amusement had replaced religion as the opiate of the people. Of course, just like today, sometimes opium was still the opiate of the people. But in the Gilded Age, everyday Americans could experience all kinds of entertainments and diversions, including baseball for both whites and for blacks, community parks and programs, dance halls and theaters. Inexpensive paperback books were not yet available, but public libraries allowed everyday Americans access to a vast array of reading materials. Most African Americans, however, were relegated to inferior, underfunded libraries. Certainly, some government reforms directly aided everyday Americans, like enhancing democracy by taming the local political bosses. Most scholars now believe that there was no discrete Gilded Age followed by a progressive reform era. Instead, there was a constant negotiation between the vast power of the wealthy and the efforts of progressive reformers to rein in that power. Progressive leader Fighting Bob La Follette called the controversies over railroads, the tariff, conservation, currency, and the trusts that we see here, all manifestations of one great struggle. The supreme issue involving all the others is the encroachment of the powerful few upon the rights of the many. Everyday Americans benefited from important progressive legislation, like the Pure Food and Drug Act, safety laws, environmental protections, and political reforms. The system that allowed seats in the Senate to essentially be sold to the highest bidder was replaced by the 17th Amendment, requiring that senators be elected by the people rather than the state legislators. This honest voter, armed with direct democracy measures, the initiative, and the referendum, is driving the corrupt from the legislature. Everyday Americans also benefited from non-governmental and nonprofit organizations ranging from the NAACP to settlement houses. Here is perhaps the most famous of the settlement houses, run by Jane Addams in Chicago. But in cities all across the nation, community centers like this one helped residents to learn important skills and American ways, including how to read and write in English, how to fill out a job application, how to become a U.S. citizen, how to vote in American elections. Religion also had a huge impact on everyday Americans. Some critics repeated the Marxist maxim that religion, like the one being offered in this tent revival, remained the opiate of the masses, keeping the poor complacent. Other critics worried about the loss of religion. Here we see the descent of the modernists. Presumably it was a short step from atheism right into hell. But there was a lot of middle ground between unquestioning faith in the one extreme and godlessness on the other. There were several gospels at work in the Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie preached the gospel of wealth. He gave millions of dollars to causes he deemed worthy, funding libraries and schools, but there was a bit of a catch to his philanthropy. In this cartoon, a whip-wielding Carnegie rests on his bags of money during a lockout of his workers during the 1892 Homestead strike against the Carnegie Steel Company. The working men ask, "Mr. Carnegie, you are worth several million. Can't you give us wages enough to clothe and feed our families and send our children to school?" At the end, Carnegie tells Henry Frick, "Close the works and crush these people," a directive justified by the gospel of wealth. As lawyer George F. Bauer explained in opposing any intervention by the government in the coal strike of 1902, the rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men of property to whom God has given control of the property rights of this country, and upon the successful management of which so much depends. Famous for giving out dimes, John D. Rockefeller also preached the gospel of wealth, saying simply, "God gave me my money." Other Americans rejected as blasphemous such assertions that the wealthy were favored by God. They countered with the social gospel. Its adherents asked, what would Jesus do? And following the teachings of William T. Snead, author of the 1894 bestseller, If Christ Came to Chicago. It wasn't just enough to pray for the poor. Christians should do all they could on the ground in meaningful ways to improve the lives of the disadvantaged and the suffering. Many everyday Americans could not afford even basic health care, but there were some advances in public health. County agents, including many women, traveled to rural areas, offering lessons in hygiene and disease prevention. Industrialization and urbanization offered a lot of new opportunities for women, challenging conventional notions about their rightful place. Critics insisted that nothing should change. Women should continue to live out the 4 cardinal female virtues: purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity. There are millions of images of ideal womanhood like this one, and I challenge you to find one that doesn't have a kitten. Other images characterizing women were far more condescending. Here we see the female mind magnified, taken up by fashion, romance, babies, puppies, and chocolates. No room or capacity here for a paid career. These women and girls providing cheap factory labor were judged to be acceptable. They're just sewing, after all, and not really challenging male dominance. But some middle-class women were demanding greater opportunities. According to the caption, woman devotes her time to gossip and clothes because she has nothing else to talk about. Give her broader interests and she will cease to be vain and frivolous. Others predicted a far more sinister outcome if women abandoned their traditional roles and values. We see here the ultimate price woman pays for selfishly seeking out fame as she abandons love, marriage, children, and home for ambition. Oh, sure, she acquires social achievements, admiration, a career, artistic success, professional triumph, and flattery. But in the end, she pays the price: disappointment, strife, anxiety, and loneliness. You'll note that suffrage is included in those final damning steps, and we're going to come to that in a minute. But for now, increasing numbers of women fought back against the insistence that they could only find true happiness in the home, caring for others. Some women argued that the very qualities ascribed to them, selflessness, care for others, concern for future generations, sentimentalism, always being near kittens, actually demanded that they apply their virtues to the new urban society. What kind of women would they be if they allowed men's single-minded pursuit of profit to continue unchecked? As mothers, should they condone child labor? Here, a breaker boss stands with his stick, ready to strike any boy not picking slate from coal with sufficient speed and efficiency. And as an aside, my great-grandfather became a breaker boy after his parents died on the boat coming over on the way from Ireland. Could a decent woman turn a blind eye to these boys any more than she could girls working in the textile industry? Could she call herself a true woman and allow children to be sacrificed on the altar of profit? And what about the non-human environment? As you can see in this gorgeous photo of a lumber camp in 1895, 2 of the women pose with brooms, and another pours coffee from a silver pot into a china cup, a visual representation of their roles as the housekeepers and the civilizers, not the greedy exploiters. For generations, women had been told by people like Susan Fenimore Cooper, with the unfortunate hairstyle here, that they bore a special responsibility for the preservation and conservation of natural resources from the avarice of men. Cooper's book, Rural Hours, went through 9 editions in its first 40 years, cementing the role of women as nature's housekeepers. The nation's seemingly unlimited natural resources were disappearing at an alarming rate in the Gilded Age. How should women, who were expected to be the frugal housekeepers, view this mountain of buffalo skulls, all that remains after their wanton slaughter? And many were mortified by living conditions in cities built exclusively for business and profit. Yes, those children are playing next to a dead horse. When told to mind their own business, women replied that they were minding their own business. They were the ones doing the shopping and unwittingly bringing home impure food because the Beef Trust was selling only chemical corned beef, putrefied pork, and potted poison. When the family members got sick, they dosed them with drugstore elixirs so tainted that it made them even sicker because it was actually palatable poison. Housewives like these insisted that it was their obligation as wives and mothers to take action, to bring their natural purity and caring instincts to the new urban industrial society. And when they found that their moral authority wasn't sufficient, many began to demand the vote. It is true that some in the suffrage movement emphasized the importance of full equality. Carrie Chapman Catt, for example, proclaimed unequivocally, "The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty." But most everyday American women claimed that they deserved the vote not so that they could compete for political power with men, but simply so that they could bring their female sensibilities to bear against the nation's pressing problems, striving to stop prostitution, sweatshops, and to save the children. In 1913, Belle Case La Follette, wife of Fighting Bob, testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Women's Suffrage. She had long argued that women merited the vote based on their service as public housekeepers. According to her, one fundamental reason for equal suffrage is that it will arouse homemakers of today to a realization that they can only do their part, the part their mothers and grandmothers did, for the home when they use the ballot to secure these standards of cleanliness and healthfulness for the municipal home, which were established in earlier times for the isolated home. La Follette was hardly alone in downplaying or even eschewing the feminist argument of true equality in favor of a generally more palatable, less radical, and therefore less threatening domestic rationale. As the first sign says here, women need votes to get stricter pure food laws. La Follette and other suffrage leaders urged that women receive the vote not as a rejection of the prevailing construction of womanhood, but as women's logical fulfillment as the naturally more moral sex, providing purification because they were generally superior to men in their selflessness and dedication to the greater good. That is, women deserve the vote because of their sex, not despite it. According to this view, a woman's roles as homemaker and mother were her greatest political credentials, and granting women the vote was the only way to achieve things like pure food, factory inspections, and child labor laws. Clara Burdett, a leading light in the women's club movement, described the new role for women in urban industrial society. "The woman's place is in the home," she emphasized before adding, but today, would she serve the home? She must go beyond the home. No longer is the home encompassed by four walls. Many of its important activities lie now involved in the bigger family of the city and the state. Journalist Radclyffe Hall called community home, city dwellers the family, and public schools the nursery, adding, and badly do the home and the family and the nursery need their mother. In the words of a Denver member of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, Uncle Sam has been conducting his house on bachelor principles. You can see the results on the left, the dark city filled with saloons, cheap taverns, and red light dives. But the woman's vote brings public playgrounds, libraries, and schools into the light. What could be less threatening than these adorable little babies asking that their mothers be given the vote? Belle LaFollette repeatedly confirmed that in modern times, women's suffrage was in no way a rejection of woman's essential role as wife and mother. Significantly, she had also long simultaneously maintained the more feminist assertion that men and women are equally and mutually concerned in government, and it is only when they equally understand and are responsible that we shall secure a well-balanced democracy. In her address to the Senate committee, LaFollette called women's suffrage a simple matter of common sense, before concluding, you know how Lincoln defined government at Gettysburg. Ours is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And are not women people? Opponents to women's suffrage proclaimed that the nation would go to rack and ruin, with women smoking cigars, drinking in bars, and ignoring their children. Men would be reduced to holding screaming babies while darning socks and making trousers out of their wives' old skirts. Other critics predicted economic ruin in the form of higher taxes and general ruin to employment and business, while others predicted total political ruin, warning, for example, that women's suffrage and socialism go hand in hand. Women of color skillfully played the gender card emphasized by LaFollette and others, arguing that their authority as wives and mothers authorized them to demand better schools and playgrounds for their children, as well as better living and working conditions and an end to lynching. Black women playing the gender card were somewhat less threatening to some whites than were the black men who were campaigning for racial justice. But anti-black racism complicated the women's suffrage movement nonetheless. The white South had successfully implemented a variety of ways to prevent African American men from voting, and feared that the passage of the 19th Amendment would bring increased scrutiny. The third bullet point in this Georgia handbill urging the defeat of women's suffrage states their case plainly. Vote against women's suffrage because universal suffrage wipes out the disfranchisement of the Negro by law. And the final bullet point, vote against women's suffrage because white supremacy must be maintained. Mississippi Senator John Sharp Williams told Jeanette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress and a staunch advocate of the 19th Amendment, if we passed your amendment, then Negro women could vote. She does not respond with a vigorous defense of the rights and equality of her black sisters, asking instead, but couldn't you keep them from voting the same way you keep the Negro man from voting? Revered suffrage leader Carrie Chapman Catt, who spoke so movingly about women's liberty and equality, offered the unequivocal reassurance to the southern wall of opposition in Congress to the women's vote. Because the population of white women in the South was larger than the number of black men and women combined, quote, white supremacy will be strengthened, not weakened, by women's suffrage. Belle LaFollette, in the thick of this fight, refused to accept that the only way for women to win the vote was to curry favor with racists, denying the rights of African Americans. She skewered the hypocrisy of her sister racists. "It seems strange," she observed caustically, "that the very ones who consider it a hardship to sit next to a colored person in a streetcar entrust their children to colored servants and eat food prepared by colored hands." Racial equality in all things, she asserted, is in no way a matter of social privilege. It is a matter of civil right. Merit, not sympathy, demands that Negroes should not be discriminated against and should be accorded the justice due them as citizens of a democracy. The African Americans who had been working diligently on behalf of women's suffrage had been unceremoniously thrown under the bus by their white sisters. But the women continued to use their gender to advocate for their race. There's one more element of gender that I'd like to introduce: the discovery of the homosexual. Yes, of course, same-sex sexuality has been around since the beginning of time, but while farmers might have met out behind the barn to have a tryst, prior to the Gilded Age, almost all Americans lived in heterosexual family units that were dictated by the economics of rural life. Same-sex sex was something that people did on occasion, but it didn't define who they were or how they lived. The new urban life, however, made what we would call a gay lifestyle possible. Men could find each other in urban parks and certain bars. Unmarried professional women who could support themselves could live together in what have been termed Boston marriages. Here, for example, we see M. Carey Thomas on the left, president of Bryn Mawr, and English professor Mamie Gwynn. Such couples weren't suspected of being lesbians, but were simply those two nice spinsters who lived together. Working-class lesbians rarely made enough money to afford to live together, but a few passed as men, earning higher wages and marrying other women. Here is an account of Cora Anderson, born Ralph Carwinio, and this one is devoted to Murray Hill, very active in local politics, also born a woman. But the period in which many homosexuals and transsexuals could fly under the radar was short-lived. After the term homosexual was introduced, a Beware the Homosexual campaign began in earnest. Here's the British author Radclyffe Hall, the unofficial poster girl for that campaign. "How will you know the lesbian? She hates men. She wears short hair, trousers, and low-heeled shoes." Homosexual men were stereotyped as effeminate and weak. It was a lot like the Beware of Strangers campaign of my childhood. We kids knew to be wary of men in trench coats wearing fedoras, the identifying signs of child predators. This ignored, of course, the fact that the vast majority of child molesters were then and now either family members or family friends and didn't wear trench coats or fedoras. Homosexuals also quickly learned to remain undetected by avoiding the most extreme stereotypes. I've been particularly struck by how, more than 100 years ago, these stereotypes concerning homosexual men were so well established as to be immediately recognizable by the end of the Gilded Age. Once war broke out in Europe, former President Theodore Roosevelt, depicted here as a warrior with his spear and shield, demanded that the United States launch a huge military preparedness campaign. An extremely effeminate, limp-wristed Uncle Sam is saying, "Theodore, if you don't stop taunting me about unpreparedness, I'll just slap you on the wrist." And the same limp-wristed effeminacy is visible in this cartoon. drawn shortly after the war to show the impotence of the Paris Peace Conference, as a simpering police officer simply looks on at poor, beleaguered Europe about to be clobbered by Bolshevism, beseeches him, "Officer, call a real policeman." Similar kinds of images were used to lampoon environmentalists. Here, John Muir is shown in a dress, flowery bonnet, and apron as he fruitlessly tries to sweep back the waters of progress that are flooding Hetch Hetchy Valley. And in 1912, the entire Republican leadership was rendered in drag. Their inter-party squabbling depicted as a gossipy, backbiting ladies' tea party. If you want to make men look ridiculous, present them as women. So, team, we've covered race, labor, leisure, gender, sexuality, health, ethnicity, religion, legislation, nonprofits, and I could still go on, but then it seems that I already have. So, to wrap this up, as Michael Cullinane established so beautifully in the opening talk of this series, and all the subsequent lectures have shown, the long Gilded Age and Progressive Era did indeed showcase an America in transition, a period of innovation that continues to shape this nation. And the everyday Americans who populated that period and created that transformation defy simple definitions. Just as the life of the elite members of society weren't filled exclusively with fancy balls and parties, the life of everyday Americans was not made up entirely of suffering, exploitation, and failed rebellion. Just like the everyday Americans today, they came in different colors, they practiced different faiths, or no faith at all. Some were middle class, some were poor, some were satisfied with their lot and enjoyed the opportunities provided by the newly urbanized and industrialized nation. Others fought hard for those same opportunities. Everyday Americans built the railroads. They mined the coal that powered the country, and the iron that made the steel necessary to create the skyscraper described by Richard Guy Wilson in the previous talk in this series. Everyday Americans manufactured the nation's goods, and they raised the next generation of Americans. And in the end, a tremendous amount of action, reaction, and interaction among Americans of all stripes contributed to this period of astonishing innovation and transition in American history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Unger. I really enjoy your speech. I'm Danny, a research fellow at the Preservation Society. For my question, I'm really curious about what drew your attention to this topic at the very beginning. Was there a particular news or object that you saw? Thank you so much in advance.
Oh, that's a great question, and I always love talking about me. So I will tell you, when I was in graduate school, I was casting about for a dissertation topic. And I came across a little description of Robert LaFollette, a great progressive senator from Wisconsin. And as I read what he had done, I thought, number one, why have I not heard of this guy? And I was also so struck by the similarities, even back then, between the Gilded Age and Progressive Era and today. I mean, right now we have so much of the same kind of incredible technology, computers, the information age, and it's getting ahead of us. You know, it's hard to legislate and predict where it's going to go. So for me, it's a fascinating subject. The period is fascinating in its own right. But I also think that, I can't tell you how impatient I get when people say to me, oh, history. I loved history in school, but I had to do something more practical. And I think there is nothing more practical than studying history. To me, when you study history, okay, what worked in the past? What didn't work? You don't have to invent the wheel every time. You know, you can learn a lot from it. So this is a period that, to me, is very similar to our own in many ways. Very different in many ways. But I think it's a practical subject and really worthwhile and useful. And I just wish it had a different title. Gilded Age confuses people. Gilded Age progressive era is like, is it two? But what is it? The society that I was president of, the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, our acronym is SCAPE. Sounds like we're all drunk. So I think it needs better PR. So I'm particularly thrilled that this series is going on to maybe elevate it a bit. But I really do think it's a very useful study.
Thank you so much, Dr. Unger. Could you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between Senator LaFollette and his wife? Did they ever butt heads, or were they on the same page in terms of their progressive objectives?
I think she was more liberal, more radical than he was, but she also didn't have to worry about getting reelected. So I'm not, but I think deep down, I think she was more radical, but they really were quite a remarkable team. And when I say that they were a remarkable team, I'm gonna have to use the F word here. Bob LaFollette was a feminist, which, I mean, is just remarkable. I mean, he's just like, well, of course she's fabulous and we're equals, and he rarely made a move without her. So they're really quite a remarkable political team. Although, I mean, Bob LaFollette is my first love, but Belle LaFollette continues to come up because most of her life, she didn't have the vote, she didn't have political power, and yet she was still able to achieve a great deal. So, I mean, I love the LaFollettes, and I love to go to. They were in Wisconsin, so as I like to say, I'm world famous in Madison, Wisconsin. So, because they're still pretty strong figures there. So yeah, thank you for that question.
I just want to, again, thank you so much for being our speaker and closing up our series. Thank you so much, Dr. Unger, and thank you all for joining us. Please join us out on the terrace for reception. And again, Dr. Unger will be signing 2 of her books that are also for purchase. Thank you for joining our Gilded Age series.